Hello and welcome to EE 333. I'm your instructor, Gregory Myers. This video, we're going to take a look at a companion function to our toCSV file function that we wrote in an earlier video, and that is going to be our fromCSV file. So the idea is that if you want to be able to export to a file, somehow you also want to be able to import from a file. So what we're going to do is, if you have not yet taken a look at this video, you should take a look at the toCSV file video. It's part of a larger series of videos in the fundamentals demo. You also need to have made sure to start constructing your user class and also looking at static methods. But if you've done all of that, let's go ahead and jump on into this. And so the idea here is we want to leverage this array list. And the idea being is that we want to ultimately be able to read in these users from a source file, in this particular case, a users.csv file, such that maybe the last time your application closed, you saved all of these users to a CSV file. Now, when you launch your application again, you won't be able to read them back in as opposed to have to manually type them in. So what we want to do now is we want to create another function. We can decide what the input and the output arguments are. We can also create additional overloads, but what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that this is another static function, meaning that it's shared among all the instances of the user, or you can think of it as that it is a method associated with the class as opposed to a specific user. Either version of that is fine as long as it makes sense to you. So to begin with here, we're going to have a public static, and then for the return value on our fromCSV file, we can debate about what we would like to return. There are a number of options. We can return a string. That string, for instance, may represent the contents of the file. That could be considered useful. We could also return an integer. That might simply represent the number of users that were imported into your system. You could also just simply return a void, which would probably be a little bit disconcerting to your user, whoever's using your application, because that wouldn't really give them any information, or rather a developer that would be using your library here, your function, wouldn't give them a lot of information, a lot of confidence in what's going on. So we've got a number of options, but what I'd like to do is I want to keep it kind of a little bit noisy right now. In other words, I want to be able to see everything, and then we can refine this later on, which means I'm just going to go ahead and choose to return a string. And that string is just simply going to be the output of the file. And so for our function name, we're simply going to call it fromCSV file. And for this particular instance of it, we are not going to have an input argument. Later on, we'll come back and revisit this. We'll build another overload that accepts a file name. But right now, we're going to hard code the file name simply as users.csv. So at this point, we can go ahead and create a couple of temporary variables, not the least of which will be our output variable. At that point, then we can simply say return output, and that way we should have functioning code. And then from there, what we want to do is we want to start thinking about the objects that we're going to need to successfully read in a file. Now, I've already created a file reader demo, and I would encourage you to watch that. And if you've not yet done so, take a second to go ahead and watch it, because this video is going to make a lot more sense than when we're not going to spend as much time talking about each one of the objects. But essentially what we need here is we need three things. We need a java.io.file that we're simply going to call our input file. We need a java.io.file reader, which is going to allow us to open the file. And so we're simply going to call that our input file reader. And then the third component of this is going to be the java.io.buffered reader, which is going to essentially help us with buffering or reading a portion of the file at a time. And we're just going to simply call this one our input buffered reader. All right, and then at this point, then we probably also want to have a temporary variable of a user. So in this case, we're going to create an EE333.user. We're simply going to call it a temp user. And I'm going to put a little comment here that's going to seem a little strange. And that is, we simply may not need to use this. And you'll see why in just a second. And then also for convenience, and the temp user variable sort of falls into the convenience variables, we probably ought to go ahead and create a couple of convenience variables, the ID being one of them, the first name being another, the last name being the third one, the age, and then ultimately the status. So EE333.user.status. And we're simply going to use a local variable called status on this one. And we can, for instance, initialize the age to a value and the status to a value. We'll come back to that as well. Now, at this point, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and set up a try catch. And we simply want to catch any java.lang.exception that we might get. And by the way, I've forgotten a couple of temporary variables up here that we need to have real quick from our earlier example as well. If we have we're going to be parsing the file looking for commas, then we want to have two additional variables. One is going to represent a line in the file, and the other one is going to be an array of chunks that were essentially, when we break that line apart based on the semicolons, then we're going to store it into a chunks variable and keep track of how many chunks there are in a given file, or a given line rather. All right, so at this point then what we want to do is we want to go ahead and check to see if the file exists. And to do that, we want to go ahead and initialize our input file equal to the new java.io.file. And here's where we're simply going to hard code our users.csv. And then this is one of the reasons that I like this java.io.file object, in that it allows for us to check to see if our input file even exists, as well as other properties about it. And if it does not exist, then clearly we can't continue here. As a matter of fact, what we want to do right off the bat is just simply say, or reaffirm rather, that our output was equal to the empty quotes. But if it does exist, then what we want to do is we want to initialize our file reader. So our file reader is equal to new java.io.file reader, and the file reader accepts a input file as its input argument, file reader. And then the other thing that we want to do is we want to go ahead and initialize our buffered, our input. Sorry, here I forgot the input here. So it's input file reader and input buffered reader. And we want to initialize that now to a new java.io.buffered reader, which accepts an input argument of an input file reader. Okay, so you can sort of think of the file reader as allowing us access to the file to be able to read from it. And then the buffered reader just allows for us then to read it in a controlled manner, as opposed to getting all of it at once. And at this point then, this should start looking very similar to C, and that after you have opened these, you also want to make sure to go ahead and close them. We'll close the input buffered reader first, since we opened it last. And we'll also go ahead and close the input file reader. This just assures us that we are releasing the resources associated with reading this file. And then in between the two, we want to use a while loop to capture the value from the file line by line using our input buffered reader. And we have a readLine method. My autocomplete seems to be having a lot of fun with me here for some reason. I'm gonna have to figure out what's going on there. So what we want to do is we want to use the readLine method of our input buffered reader, and we assign whatever that return value is to the line variable, and we continue this process while it is not equal to null. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to pull this out line by line out of the file. Once we have a line, then what we want to use is the string split function of the string. So in this case, we're going to take the line, which is a string, and we want to split it looking for those commas. And in this case, if the chunks.length is equal to 5, in other words, if splitting that line results in 5 smaller strings, then we know we have, or we're going to assume that we have a valid data. So we're making a very strong and a very dangerous assumption here, but we're going to assume that we have 5 pieces of actual data. We need to validate. Okay, we're not going to cover that in this video, but if we don't have 5 pieces, we're simply going to skip it, which means that we will need to think about how this will work when we start adding additional attributes to our file. In other words, at some point you may have an older file format that you have to then convert into a newer file format, which means that that may be a great opportunity for us to write an additional function that allows for us to convert from a 5-column CSV file into a 6-column CSV file. But at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to assume that you are going to do the validation. And at this point, then we simply use these temporary variables to say ID is equal to chunks square bracket 0, which means the first column, first name is going to be equal to chunks square brackets 1. Last name equal to chunks square brackets 2. Then we get to the age, which means that we're going to need to leverage the integer, and specifically the integer, and we want to parse it. Okay, so basically what we're going to do is we're going to parse the integer from a string, and we're going to use chunks square brackets 3, which is the 4th column. And then lastly, we want to parse our enum. And in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to throw an additional try-catch. And we're going to just go ahead and capture it as a java.lang.exception. And in this case, I'm going to call it a parse, EX, parse exception. And not only do we want to go ahead and still print it out to the command line, whatever the value of that inner exception happens to be, but we also need to set the default value for that status to simply equal to ee333.user.status. Oops, went past it there. Status.dirty, because essentially we're in an unknown state. But inside the try branch, what we want to do is we want to use the parsing capabilities of our enum. So we'll have a ee333.user dot status, and you'll see there's a value of function, and it will simply take the value of whatever is in chunks square brackets 4, and if it is a valid enum, it will convert it into an enum type, assign it to the status. If not, it's going to throw an exception, which we will see. And at this point, then, we're going to assume that you have validated the other 4 fields, and we can simply create a new user. Now, this is where that temp user comes into play. You don't have to use it, but it is convenient because we can say a new EE333.user, and we can pass to it based on, let's see here, not sure why my autocomplete is not working for me here. It's not giving me my, all right, we'll see here where my typo is in just a second. There's first name, last name, and then the age, and then, so for some reason my autocomplete is, I think, is giving up on me today. So we also want to go ahead and assign then the status. So this is where we use the set status. All right, let's go back here. For some reason, it has auto-completed again to something I did not want. I've got to figure out exactly what's going on here. So there we go. So set status. All right, so we're just going to do this the old-fashioned way for a minute here. So set status, and we're going to simply pass whatever that status is. All right, at this point, since we have declared that user and we have initialized it using the constructor, remember that a call to the constructor will automatically add that item to the user's array list. In this case, we're using this third constructor here. So at this point, what we have successfully done is imported from that file into our array list, and that's all that we need to do. Now, the reason I say that we don't technically need our temp user is there is also an alternate way that we could do this, but for right now, what we're going to do is we're going to leverage the temp user, and we'll just override it essentially every time we read a new value out of the file, or essentially read a new valid line out of our file. So let's go ahead and build it. Let's make sure that we don't have any errors. Let's come back here to our fundamentals.java. Let's go ahead and create another function here to test this. So it's going to be another public static void, and in this case it's going to be our fromCSVFileDemo, and we'll worry about input arguments later. At this point, though, what we want to do is we simply want to make a call to that static method and see what happens. But in order to actually be able to prove what happens, we need to be able to see some value or some return from this static function. And that goes back to why I said that we needed some sort of return. If we had a void return argument, then we would know that anything actually happened. Integer could tell us how many users we actually successfully pulled in. But in this case, what we want to do is we simply want to capture the output from the file. And in order to be able to do that, what we'll do is every time we read a line out of the file, we'll simply say output equal to that line. And that's just simply going to append then the information. The other thing that we probably ought to consider doing is adding a new line onto that so that we don't have just a giant mess all in one line. So at this point then, we'll leave that alone for right now. The only other thing that I did accidentally miss that I just saw is we did not do our system.out.println for our outer exception here. And so we simply want to once again do the toString method for that. And lastly, we are returning the output. Now, back to our fundamentals.java. So hopefully you can see what we're going to do here. We're just going to simply call our fromCSV file method, and then ultimately all of that data is going to be stored in our shared users array. Now, we need to do a couple of things. Number one is we want to go ahead and capture in a results variable that output from the file, and then we just want to print it so that we can see it. So we'll say results equal to ee333 dot user dot from CSV file. And then just to prove that we've actually done something, we'll throw in a system.out.println, and we'll simply print our results. And you probably ought to take a second to go ahead and add maybe a little more information up here, maybe something along the lines of a prompt that says calling from CSV file. Completely up to you. Basically, the idea is that you can acknowledge what's going on here. Now, at this point, to actually demonstrate that this is useful, we probably want to go ahead and add another user. So let's go ahead and run this first. Let's see if we've got this part working. I come out here to my command line, and instead of my toCSVFileDemo, I'm going to run my fromCSVFileDemo. And it's not going to do anything because I don't think we've updated our main yet. Let's go ahead and take a second to do that. All right, so there's our toCSVFileDemo. Let's go ahead and change the switch to from. All right, now we should be set to go. And you'll see that we are calling from CSV file, and you'll see that it's just simply outputting the file, the contents of the file to the command line. Not extremely useful, not even terribly informative, and perhaps still just a little bit disconcerting. So we haven't done anything to the file other than just simply read it. So let's go ahead and see if we've accomplished anything by adding another user. So we're going to create one more user here. So ee333.user. We're going to once again call this one user A. And at this point, we'll simply say user A is equal to new ee333.user new rather. And then at this point, then let's create a new user here. We're going to call M Jones with a first name Mary, last name Jones, and we'll make this person 35. And then to show some persistence, in other words, to show that we've actually successfully added someone, what you want to do now is you want to make a call to our ee333.user.toCSV file. And once again, at this point, let's build it. And if we've actually accomplished what we set out to do, we'll see that we are importing G. Myers, J. Jones. Once we've imported them, we create a new one, and then we export it back to the file, and there you go. There is your third user. Now, we haven't checked to make sure the IDs are unique or anything like that. And then we've also got one other thing that we briefly want to talk about this time around, and we'll deal with it in a later video as well. And that is, what do you want to do if, in fact, the array list already has users in it? So at this point, whenever we read from a CSV file, every time we add a new user, it simply appends the array list. So at some point we have to decide, do we want to reset the array list and add new values from an empty array list, or do we simply just want to add to any existing users in that array list? So once again, discussion for another video, but I just want you to be aware of what we're doing here, is that essentially this is appending to that users array list because we first read in the contents of the file, in this case adding 2 users to the array list and then a third. So hopefully you found this video useful. As always, if you've got any questions or comments, don't hesitate to email me, and thank you for watching.